Good morning. My name is Brian Crowe, and I serve as the Business Relations Specialist in the Northeast area of the state. Today's presentation is on leading effective self-identification campaigns. Presenting alongside me today is my colleague, Brynne. Would you like to introduce yourself and explain the accessibility features of today's webinar?
Sure. My name is Brynne Olsen, and I am a Career Development Specialist. I also serve the Northeast region. We plan for accessibility from the start. For example, we use the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft 365 to review the learner's guide in PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and add alternative text, known as alt text, to visual images. Also, in our delivery, we mention each other by name as the conversation goes back and forth to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. After the webinar, we edit the transcript and fix any captioning errors before uploading the webinar to our on-demand library. We also include a reasonable accommodation statement in our invitation to the webinar, so if attendees need an accommodation, they know who to contact to ask. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive for everyone. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brian.
Thanks, Brynne. This webinar is an accompaniment to a previous webinar titled Creating a Workplace Culture That Supports Disability Disclosure. A link to that webinar is provided in the chat for your reference. Excuse me. In today's session, we are going to discuss leading an effective self-identification campaign. Throughout this webinar, we will discuss what self-identification is and how it differs from disability disclosure, optional versus required self-identification campaigns, the importance of self-identification campaigns, and key strategies to implement for a successful self-ID campaign. We round out today's session with how OOD can be a great resource partner to support employers in creating and maintaining disability inclusion in the workplace. We are excited to have a special guest joining us today, Patrice Harris, who serves as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for CareSource. CareSource is a healthcare company headquartered in Dayton, Ohio, and a past recipient of the Governor's Inclusive Employer Award. We look forward to learning more about their impressive work in managing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility issues, and more. Brynne, would you like to cover the business case for inclusive workplaces for our audience?
Sure, Brian. Before we share the key strategies employers can implement to lead an effective self-identification campaign, let's talk about how an inclusive workplace can lead to several benefits, like higher staff morale, larger profits, and greater productivity from staff members. We call this the business case for employing individuals with disabilities because it highlights the positive impact these inclusive efforts have on organizations. Research reveals employers who hire individuals with disabilities and prioritize workplace inclusion consistently outperform their peers in terms of higher revenues, net income, and profits. This impact to the bottom line may be attributed to what has been found in other studies as well, which shows employees with disabilities stay on the job longer, which reduces turnover costs. It also shows that employing individuals with disabilities leads to benefits, like increased productivity levels and morale.
Brynne, there are also some advantages that might be difficult to measure. Many people with disabilities have spent their lives learning to adapt to their environments. These experiences provide a natural means to developing problem-solving skills and creativity. Obviously, these are skills that are helpful in nearly every workplace.
That's a great point. Thanks, Brian. Employees with disabilities can benefit the workplace by offering innovative ideas and a variety of perspectives for problem solving. People with disabilities encounter barriers in their daily lives, and because of this, may develop a persistence and a willingness to experiment that leads to finding a way to participate in the daily activities that are important to them. So, becoming skilled at innovative thinking and identifying new ways to solve problems can be an attribute of an employee with a disability, and certainly that can be beneficial at work. Skills like that are often transferable to other work-related problems, And so you are strengthening your workplace when you not only employ individuals with disabilities, but you go beyond that to cultivate a culture of inclusion that values the skills your employees have to offer.
Well said, Brynne. This leads us to the topic of today's webinar, self-identification campaigns. Brynne, what is self-identification?
Brian, self-identification is a formal process where employees voluntarily and confidentially provide information about disability status. It is specifically used for data collection and reporting only. Some employers are required to administer self-identification campaigns, such as federal contractors subject to Section 503 regulations. We will discuss these requirements a little later in the presentation. Some organizations may choose to utilize these campaigns to contribute to creating a disability-inclusive workplace. To get an idea of how many members of our audience work for organizations with self-identification campaigns, let's have a quick poll. Brian, would you read our poll question to the audience?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. A poll question will appear on your screen. We'd like to know from our audience, has your company engaged in a self-identification campaign? Please select yes or no. Okay, it appears everyone has selected. The answer is yes, and it's great to have you here. We hope you can share what has worked best for your organization throughout this webinar. Please drop your comments in the chat, as we would love and enjoy learning from you. Brynne, can you take a moment to discuss disability disclosure and how this differs from self-identification?
Sure, Brian. Self-identification and disability disclosure sound very similar. They are not the same. When a person discloses a disability, they are voluntarily sharing information about their disability outside of a self-identification program. It's important to know a few things about disclosure. First, disclosing a disability at work is not required. The choice to disclose is a personal one and is always a decision of the individual. However, a person may choose to disclose because it's necessary to receive a reasonable accommodation, or they may disclose to contribute to creating a disability-inclusive culture. And lastly, an employee is permitted to disclose a disability at any time during the hiring process or employment.
You're muted, Brian.
My apologies. We have an archived webinar called the Employer's Reasonable Accommodation Handbook, and we've included an entire session titled, What Can I Ask and Why? That addressed disability-related questions employers can and can't ask of candidates and employees. We have placed a link to that webinar in the chat if you'd like to learn more. Let's turn our attention to requirements under Section 503 around self-identification.
Brian, Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act requires federal contractors and subcontractors to set targets and plan affirmative action towards employing qualified individuals with disabilities. Employers with federal government contracts or subcontracts of $10,000 or more are covered, and the rules put requirements in place around recruiting, hiring, and accommodating individuals with disabilities. These requirements also set workforce goals. The 7% goal applies to job groups or entire workforce, depending on your company size. This is not a quota, but an effort to become more intentional with disability inclusion and a way to invite applicants and employees to self-identify. All self-identification information must be voluntary and confidential, so candidates and employees are not required to self-identify. Federal contractors are required to invite employees to self-identify during the pre-offer and post-offer phases of the application process and at least every 5 years. Compliance with Section 503 is enforced by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, or OFCCP.
Brynne, Section 503 also includes provisions for federal contractors to create partnerships with disability organizations for assistance with recruitment of qualified individuals with disabilities. This is where OOD can be a great help. Our no-cost services like candidate sourcing, hiring events, and workplace accessibility consultations can help your organization make progress towards your goals. Brynne, can you share the guidelines for employers who are not subject to Section 503 requirements who host self-identification campaigns?
Sure, Brian. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, does speak to self-identification campaigns, and following the ADA guidelines does help to minimize legal risk, but also reinforces to employees that the employer cares about them and their workplace culture. So, as far as what the employer can ask, the ADA states that inviting or asking candidates and employees to self-identify as having a disability does not conflict with the ADA when certain guidelines are met. The guidelines that Equal Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, provides are these. Individuals who choose to not self-identify should not be penalized. The information collected from the campaign should be stored separate from other personnel files. And information cannot be made available or used for employment decisions, such as with hiring or performance. And specific language must be used in the invitation for individuals to self-identify. If employers are curious about what to include or communicate to all candidates and employees in a self-identification invitation, we did include a link in the resource guide to an example of one provided by the OFCCP.
Lastly, Brynne, guidance from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, says an employer may invite applicants and employees to voluntarily self-identify if the employer is using the information obtained to benefit individuals with disabilities. For example, gaining insight into your workforce and what their potential needs may be. Okay, we've discussed the requirements for employers who are subject to Section 503 requirements. But let's move beyond compliance and talk about some self-identification statistics and why it's important for an employer to administer self-identification campaigns.
Sure, Brian. According to a 2019 survey conducted by the National Industry Liaison Group, NILG, a membership organization for federal contractors, most companies see only 1 to 2% of the workforce identifying as a person with a disability. And we know most employees in the workplace who have a disability have an invisible disability, meaning a disability that is not readily apparent. This emphasizes the importance of self-identification campaigns. Employers can gain valuable information and insight into their workforce, enabling them to better respond to the needs of employees with disabilities.
Exactly, Brynne, which is why self-identification can serve as such a powerful tool and catalyst for fostering diversity and inclusion in the workplace. The data obtained from the campaign can be effective in addressing barriers in recruiting, hiring, and supporting employees with disabilities. Whether an employer is required under Section 503 or is proactive in taking measures to practice affirmative actions, self-ID campaigns signal a commitment by the employer they are interested in creating and maintaining a diverse workforce. The data can also serve as a means to measure or address workplace accessibility and anticipate reasonable accommodations. When engagement is high, an employer can experience more accurate data at the application stage, offer stage, or within the current workforce. This information will then help inform and prioritize action steps employers can take to advance their disability inclusion efforts, leading to a more inclusive workplace.
Right, Brian. And employers who take deliberate steps in creating or maintaining an inclusive workplace will convey a message of acceptance, and that helps employees feel more comfortable in the workplace, which can naturally increase their engagement. Fostering a disability-inclusive culture can send a positive message to prospective candidates and employees with disabilities that the employer values disability inclusion in the workplace. When employees feel valued and accepted by their employer, they are more likely to feel comfortable in participating in a self-identification campaign. Inclusive practices that foster an environment where employees feel valued, supported, and welcomed leads to increased employee engagement.
That's great insight, Brynne. Okay, Let's ask our audience for their ideas about how to build an inclusive workplace. Please add your response to the chat and we will respond to them in our first Q&A break. But now I am pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Patrice Harris. As we mentioned previously, Patrice serves as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for CareSource. Her full bio was included in the webinar announcement. Welcome, Patrice. It's so nice to have you join us today.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate this opportunity. Let me first start by saying, again, my name is Patrice Harris. I am a middle-aged African-American woman with shoulder-length dark brown hair. Today, I am wearing tortoise-colored glasses and diamond hoops with a black turtleneck and a black and white sweater. We are in the process of encouraging our employees to provide their physical description when starting a meeting or speaking in a meeting to enhance our disability inclusion strategy and our culture of inclusivity.
Fantastic. Well, we've had a chance to talk, and I look forward to you sharing more about how CareSource has implemented inclusive practices throughout the business and the self-identification campaigns you've hosted. Starting off, would you share with our attendees how the model for inclusivity is supported by leadership?
Absolutely. To do that, I would like to just lay a foundation for something, if that's okay first. Here at CareSource, we lead with our mission. And our mission is, let me make sure I get this right, is to make a lasting difference in our members' lives by improving their health and well-being. To make a lasting difference in our members' lives by improving their health and well-being. What that means for us is the goal that we do internally around promoting diversity, equity, and inclusivity is to create, yes, an inclusive environment for our employees, but ultimately to ensure inclusivity for our members and to safeguard their opportunity to be as healthy as possible. Our attempt to operationalize this sentiment, I would say, is found in one of our corporate competencies, which is to create an inclusive environment. Now, you may not believe this, but this competency is required of every CareSource employee, regardless of their role, responsibility, title, and all of us are assessed twice a year through our performance review process. Now, to answer your question more concisely, our model for inclusivity is supported by our leadership, by their direct involvement, but also by what we call tone at the top. Right? So members of our ELT, our executive leadership team or C-suite, all of them are currently or have been or will be in the near future executive sponsors for our employee resource groups, our health equity advocacy team, even some of our DEI initiatives like our disability inclusion strategy. We have 2 executive sponsors, our DEI training curriculum around cultural competence. Each of those elements have an executive sponsor, so our leadership is supportive, and our executive leaders also support by holding the entire organization accountable for creating an inclusive environment, all for the purpose of creating an environment for employees, but ultimately also for our members.
That's fantastic. As we talk about hiring individuals with disabilities, what are a few of the top strategies CareSource has implemented, specifically in attracting and recruiting individuals with disabilities?
Okay. So not only do we employ what I said was the tone at the top for our DE&I strategy and our model for inclusivity, but we also have established what we call a tone from the start. This way, potential candidates or future employees know exactly from the start of their journey or relationship with us who we are, what is our position on DE&I and our disability inclusion efforts. Some of the things that we've done and are doing to establish this tone from the start and to attract and recruit individuals with disabilities include, we launched 2 new web pages on our external websites. There is a disability inclusion web page on our career site. A message is included from our CEO, right, again, that tone from the start and from the top, illustrating how disability inclusion is important to us. We we actually provide some of our engagement metrics on that webpage that are specifically or aligned with our employees with disabilities. So if an individual wants to know, well, what kind of environment am I entering into? We have a little bit of that information out there. High-level overview of our disability inclusion strategy is listed there, but we also have a vendor partner DE&I page on our caresource.com page, because we want individuals to know that this work is important to us, not only for our employees, but for our members, but also for our community partnerships that we're engaged in. Some of the more traditional strategies include posting all of our open positions on disability-specific boards, partnering with disability-focused organizations like OOD. Thank you all for assisting with both our 2024 and our 2025 intern program. Working with, I would be remiss, there's so many, but I want to at least say, working with the Harkin Institute. They're helping us to build, execute, and really expand and mature our disability inclusion strategy. And then more specifically, in order to promote, which is one of our goals, to promote disability as a positive and just a natural part of our employment experience, we give candidates the opportunity to self-identify as a person with a disability during the official applicant process. We provide accommodations for candidates that request accommodations during the interviewing process. Our talent acquisition team has done, honestly, an amazing job of enhancing our hiring process. And providing a point of contact, almost like a concierge service for anyone who needs additional support during the interview process. And then lastly, I would say, because we have employed a hybrid working or workplace model, many of our positions can be performed remotely and don't require travel into our offices. So these are just a few of the things that we have done, and we are expanding to recruit and interview and hire persons with disabilities.
Thank you very much. That was a lot of information. So I think you answered some of the next question, but are there specific initiatives to ensure information is available throughout the hiring process to the employees?
Absolutely. So we have, and yes, so all of that, the websites, the concierge service, all of those kinds of things, working directly with our benefits team. We have a senior HR executive that says all the time, she says, tell them 7 different ways, 7 different times. So we, again, that tone from the start, really trying to get that information out there. As a matter of fact, our new hires are required within the first 10 days to go through a learning experience that highlights implicit bias, but also gives a little bit of insight around our disability inclusion strategy. Again, the 2 websites, we have an internal website that we communicate to our employees once they get involved and acclimated into the environment. So yes, we try to articulate our strategy and what we expect from the very beginning as often as we can.
Fantastic. Okay, and now we'd like to pause for our first question and answer break so that the audience can ask any question you may have. Please raise your hand, your virtual hand, if you'd like to ask Patrice, Brynne, or myself a question. You may also type your question in the chat. We will also welcome back Michael Hogue to monitor the chat. To give our audience time to type in their questions into the chat, we have 2 pre-submitted questions about self-identification that we will address. Brynne, would you like to start?
Of course. The first question is, how can employers encourage potential employees and even existing employees to self-identify so that we as an employer can support them? How can our disability ERG support this type of self-identification initiative so that it is not seen as punitive? To recap a few of the strategies we discussed today, to encourage employees to feel comfortable voluntarily providing information about their disability status, employers should consider the role leadership has in reinforcing a work culture that is welcoming of people with disabilities. Employers should develop a communication plan that educates employees on the purpose of the self-identification process, clearly reinforces that participation is strictly voluntary and private, and includes the benefits to employees. The second question is, what does self-identification mean? As we shared earlier in today's presentation, self-identification is a formal process specifically used for data collection and reporting, only where employees voluntarily and confidentially provide information about disability status.
Thank you, Brynne. Michael, were there any questions from the audience dropped in the chat?
I have not seen any questions come in from the audience yet, and taking a quick look, I don't see any hands raised, but so let's press on.
Okay, sounds
Wait,
sounds
hang
good.
on, we do have a hand raised. Rudy Christian, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question? Looks like we have one that was dropped into the chat. This is for Patrice. Can you share what the culture competence curriculum looks like in the first 10 days of onboarding?
Absolutely. So for us, cultural competence is simple as your effective ability to interact, communicate with individuals who have different lived experiences than yourself, different backgrounds, right? And so within the first 10 days, there is a implicit bias course that our new hires take, but there's also another course and it has the connection between cultural competence and health equity, because again, we lead with our mission. And so everything is to support the health and wellness of our members. And then I think there are 10-day, 20-day, 30-day, and 90-day reminders giving our new hires information as to where they can find more information, for instance, our playlist and things of that nature. We also, within that time, give them a little bit of information around the ERGs that they can join to build community and things of that nature. And we're in the process of getting our ERGs more involved in the new hire process or journey itself.
Awesome. Sounds like things get off to a great start. We'll try again. Rudy Christian, if you want to use Shift Control M to unmute, you're welcome to ask a question.
Okay, my apologies on that. Again, my name is Rudy Christian, work for Challenge Unlimited. Our program, basically, we work over at the Akron Federal Building, where we have workforce team of disability members here. And one of the main things that I have a concern is we have one of the members on my squad that doesn't speak, you barely can understand him, which is very hard for us to try to communicate with the individual. He seems to understand us when we say things to him, but when he talks to us, it's more or less like he can't really speak clearly at all. And it's very hard to try to get a focus of understanding of this individual. And I just wondered if there was any type of views or ideas that can help give us some leads as to how we can help this individual over here at our locational site.
Ryan, you want to field that? I know we discussed some of that during disability etiquette training that we do for employers about alternate forms of communication that might be more effective than verbal.
Yes, yes. You can always use, ask to use pictures or state your questions in like through examples to kind of get your point across to the individual. You have to be patient with the processing time. And again, if you don't understand what the person is saying, don't pretend that you do. You have to keep being patient and ask to repeat or try to communicate a different way. A lot of people can use text, and they'll text message each other. So that kind of takes the enunciation piece out of the communication, and people can read the text messages, and that might be at least a way to start being more effective in that communication.
Awesome tips, Brian. I don't see any other questions coming into the chat right now.
All right, thanks, Michael. We will stop for another Q&A later in the webinar, and Patrice will be joining us again a little later in the webinar. We encourage the audience to drop your questions into the chat, and we'll address those then. Now let's turn our attention to Brynne for best practices for leading an effective campaign.
Thanks, Brian. We are going to discuss 10 key strategies employers can implement to lead an effective self-identification campaign. These strategies can encourage employees to feel comfortable voluntarily providing information about their disability status, leading to greater participation in your campaign. They are role of leadership, communication, overcoming employee concerns, training for managers, timing of campaign, methods for self-identification, promoting participation, analyzing data, measuring success, and post-campaign follow-up. Brian, would you get us started with leadership's role in an effective self-identification campaign?
Sure, Brynne. It takes a concerted effort at all levels of leadership to implement an effective self-identification campaign. From the top down, leadership has a critical role in providing a visible commitment and setting the tone for a work environment that is welcoming and recognizes the value of including diverse perspectives. A company's mid-level managers can be the linchpin in establishing an open line of communication with staff and carrying the company's message of inclusion and support. Providing training for your managers can set them up for successful communication, and we have some tips to address this later in the webinar. Leadership, too, can play a part in fostering communication by choosing to share their own experiences with disabilities and promote understanding among team members.
Brian, leaders with disabilities who talk openly about their experiences reinforce a work culture that is welcoming of people with disabilities. Leaders can analyze the data collected in self-identification campaigns and use the information to inform policies, allocate resources, and develop initiatives to break down barriers for job seekers and employees with disabilities. Brian, what are the things we should be aware of with communication?
Well, communication plays a large part in any inclusive workplace, and employers rely on various ways to share the invitation to self-identify. It is crucial to ensure the accessibility and availability of information for everyone, including people with disabilities. A best practice is to use plain language on the invitation, which is easy to understand, and then consider the way in which information will be accessed by the applicant or employee. If an applicant is invited to self-identify an attachment to an email, consider providing a link to the employer's intranet to avoid the unintended barrier of the attachment being missed or unable to be opened. As you begin to craft your messaging to invite employees to participate in a self-identification campaign, it is important for the company not to assume your employees understand what qualifies as a disability. An employee may not realize that certain conditions such as diabetes or cancer may qualify, and so they may not participate in the campaign. Instead, start by defining the term disability and provide some examples.
Good point, Brian. And as a reminder, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, defines an individual with a disability as someone with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. These major life activities include someone's ability to see, hear, walk, care for oneself, learn, think, and communicate. The ADA definition also includes people who have a history or record of such an impairment, or people who are regarded by others as having a disability. Another best practice with communication and self-identification campaigns is to establish a regular communication effort with employees and involve them when highlighting the organization's efforts in the areas of disability inclusion. Communicating your message in a format that is accessible and easy to understand with clearly defined terms will be helpful in communicating the company's commitment to gaining a better understanding of their workforce to build a more inclusive workplace. Brian, how can employers help to alleviate concerns of employees when administering a self-ID campaign?
Brynne, past experiences, stigma, fear of discrimination, and a negative impact on their career are all concerns that may hinder employee participation in a self-identification campaign. A strong communication plan can serve as a roadmap to overcoming employee concerns and increase participation in the campaign. An employer can start by making it clear to employees that participation in the campaign is strictly voluntary and their privacy will be protected by securely storing the information gathered from the campaign separate from hiring or employee information. Another tip in overcoming employee concerns is to share exactly how the information will be used. Specifically, employees can be reassured the employer is only using aggregate numbers, not identifying information specific to an individual with a disability. It is important that employees are educated and know the purpose of the self-identification process, informing them that the self-identification campaign is used strictly for data collection and reporting, benchmarking progress for recruiting initiatives, and fostering an inclusive workplace are all positive impacts to the workplace that can be made from gathering this information.
Excellent points, Brian. This will go a long way to reinforce the use of the information, build trust, and support the message of the employer's commitment to identify gaps in recruiting, hiring, retaining, and promoting people with disabilities. Let's turn to the topic of training for managers. If you remember a few moments ago, we shared the important role a manager has in establishing an open line of communication with staff and carrying the company's message of inclusion and support. To effectively do that, companies should consider training their managers on the purpose and goals of the self-identification campaign. This puts them in a better position to answer staff questions about the process, individually or through team meetings. Remember to train managers to emphasize to staff that participation is voluntary and confidential. Reiterate that the manager will not have access to the information unless an accommodation is needed and they are involved in the implementation. Providing disability inclusion training to your managers, such as the trainings offered by OOD, will help them to more confidently facilitate self-identification conversations.
Also ensure managers are equipped to communicate the benefits to employees. For example, a self-identification campaign provides the employer with insight into potential workforce needs and accommodations that may be needed. It strengthens the company's efforts to ensure their workforce is diverse and inclusive of employees with disabilities. Next, when planning a campaign, there are some things to consider around timing. For example, federal contractors are required to invite employees to self-identify during the pre-offer and post-offer phases of the application process and at least every 5 years. Many companies have an ongoing portal to allow employees to self-identify at any time. In addition, employers can opt to hold a self-identification campaign every year. One idea is to hold the campaign in conjunction with other events, such as during your open enrollment period for benefits, when many staff are accessing the company's intranet to update plans. Another idea is to hold it during National Disability Employment Awareness Month, which is in October, so you can leverage the increased communication and events your company may be hosting to celebrate this important month. Brynne, can you share some information about the methods for self-identification?
Sure, Brian. Some organizations provide an electronic method for voluntary self-identification of disability through the internet or a company intranet site. The webpage can clearly state the purpose of self-identification, its importance in helping the organization measure its progress toward hiring individuals with disabilities, what qualifies as a disability, and how to self-identify. Federal contractors subject to Section 503 requirements must use the Voluntary Self-Identification of Disability Form, CC 305. A link to the form has been provided in the chat and is also included in the resource guide that accompanies this webinar. Brian, how can employers promote participation?
Brynne, it's important to start by identifying the commonly used ways your organization sends out messages to its employees. If by email, for example, create messages that are friendly and inviting, which encourage participation. Utilize staff meetings and equip managers or supervisors with simple and easy to read messages to reiterate input is requested and emphasize the form takes only a few minutes to complete. And include your employee resource groups. These groups naturally facilitate discussions around inclusion and can empower others to engage.
Great idea, Brian. ERG members may relay how the information is used, address hesitancy, and can also strengthen an employer's feedback loop if there are accessibility issues or other barriers. We have 2 archived webinars about ERGs on our website, and you can review them if you wish. Links have been posted in the chat. They are building and leveraging employee resource groups and boosting engagement in employee resource groups. These are only a few suggestions, but they are useful ways in which your employees are already familiar with receiving information, so you can vary the delivery for them to participate on their own, receive encouragement from peers, their supervisor, or manager. Brian, how can employers use the data from the campaign for continuous improvement?
Brynne, self-identification is focused on data collection so employers can better understand their workforce. As the results are gathered, it is important to examine what aggregate numbers reveal. When analyzing the results, consider these 4 areas. Participation rate, which is the percentage of employees who fill out the form. Response rate, for those who participated, how many identified as having a disability. Utilization rate, overall number of workforce and the number of employees having a disability. And applicant response, the total number of applicants, how many identified as having a disability. Brynne, let's talk more about measuring success and give a few examples of how the data can help an employer progress towards the goal of a more inclusive work environment.
Brian, after the data is analyzed, employers can create a benchmark for tracking progress. The benchmark can help an employer to assess where they are to the goal set, but most importantly, pinpoint improvements which can be made. For example, if the data shows a low number of applicants identifying as having a disability, an employer may want to review their process of recruiting and partner with OOD to receive referrals of qualified candidates who have a disability. If there is a high number of current employees identifying with a disability, it may signal to the employer an assessment of accessibility in the workplace is needed to anticipate or remove barriers.
And then follow up by sharing the results with all employees. Involving everyone can help drive continuous improvement throughout the organization, and it's a great way to be transparent about how the information will help make positive changes. Ultimately, all employees will feel invested and valued in the process, and it's a great way to foster an inclusive environment for all. And don't forget, OOD can be a great resource for all employers, including federal contractors, who are looking for qualified candidates with disabilities to fill their open positions. Our regional business relation teams can identify and source qualified candidates based on your position requirements. OOD can also provide a variety of disability awareness educational training sessions that will help support your organization's efforts to foster a culture of diversity and inclusion. Training the hiring professionals, supervisors, and coworkers on disability etiquette and awareness can help all staff learn ways to interact respectfully with people with disabilities. It can also help demystify stereotypes, myths, and fears about disabilities, and help remove any unintentional biases that could have a negative impact on the employee with a disability.
Great, Brian. Another resource for employers is OOD's Accessible Ohio Specialists. They can identify possible resources, accommodations, and accessibility solutions for application processes, onboarding, and employment. This service is provided at no cost. Now let's invite our guest, Patrice Harris, back to share how CareSource has led effective self-identification campaigns. Welcome back, Patrice. We have a few more questions for you.
Welcome back, Patrice. I'd like to ask you, what preparation does CareSource go through before launching a campaign?
Absolutely. We've launched since I've been here, one true self-ID campaign, and it launched on, actually, what I will say, the official ask was November the 5th. The campaign itself has been in progress this entire year, more specifically starting in July. We have a work stream that is working on the campaign and the communication and all of those things. And we identified 3 things that needed to be in place before we made this official ask. One was trust. The second one was awareness, and we wanted our campaign to include maturity or sustainability, right? And so although we've been working on it for quite some time, there were things that we did before we actually ask them to self-ID. We launched all of those web pages that we talked about earlier. We also had a number of campaigns to elevate awareness or education, a Words Matter education program around inclusive language, and there was a portion specific to ability and disability. We launched a disability etiquette guide. We launched training called A Workplace Without Limitations. We also launched an entire playbook or playlist of learnings that individuals could go to and access. We talked about extensively around the awards and acknowledgments that we've won over the years. Our ERGs, I'm speaking really fast, so sorry, but our ERGs really took the lead on ending National Disability Employment Awareness Month this year, and they hosted an event every week for 5 weeks. Our two of our executive leaders spoke at our all-staff meeting in front of our entire workforce, talked about their lived experience around disability inclusion and mental health. All of our quarterly updates around DE&I, also sprinkled in our strategy around disability inclusion, and we had a soft ask for our employees to help us build a workplace without limitations, right? And we said things like maybe consider getting involved with our ERGs or elevating your cultural competence, taking some of our courses, and also consider going out and self-IDing if you would. Then and only then once we were sure that we had built trust, that we have built awareness, and we had some sustainability, then and only then did we launch our official ask on November the 5th, right? You have to earn the right to do so. Our sustainability strategy, I'll just add, includes monthly reminders up until and throughout Q1 of next year. Our ERGs working with their communities and articulating the importance of self-ID, communicating and giving our leaders talking points, but also working with our HRBPs, our HR business partners. So as they're working with leaders, they can articulate the importance of our self-ID campaign and the details in case our leaders have questions across our organization. So plan first, do the work first, earn the right before you actually ask.
Fantastic. And that's quite a bit of information. Did you find CareSource has experienced a high number of individuals with disabilities voluntarily participating in the campaign? Did you find one strategy more effective than others as
No,
proving
to be
successful
honest,
to identify?
I
Go
have
ahead.
to be honest, it really wasn't one strategy. It was all of
Okay.
it. Again, build awareness, build trust, and include, make sure you have some sustainability in it. So again, just think with the mindset, I have to earn the right to ask.
Fantastic. Can you tell us how the collected information is analyzed to make data-driven decisions and prioritizing initiatives?
Absolutely. Twofold. Specific to our self-ID campaign, we have measured our self-ID utilization rates every quarter since Q4 of last year. And we've slowly seen those numbers uptick as we do more and more. So we were looking to see the impact of raising awareness, raising trust, right? And I have to say, once the official ask was launched, we saw those numbers, those percentages jump exponentially. And so we can say with our whole chest that our campaign has been successful. Outside of that, in general, for our disability inclusion, we look for maturity, looking from feedback with our partnerships with the Harkin Institute. We look at our Disability Equality Index scorecard that shows us how we've matured, and feedback from our national board. Again, we look at our workforce metrics. We actually look at every level of leadership. So are we improving in just individual contributors or across our leadership, because we want persons with disability at every level. And then we also look at our employee surveys, and we look specifically for individuals who have identified as individuals with a disability. How do they rate our ability to create an inclusive environment? So collectively, we take all of that information and inform our disability inclusion strategy and create action plans that we execute every single quarter.
Very good. Very good. You mentioned earlier about the employee resource groups. Can you tell me how employee resource groups are engaged when the company is working on its various inclusion initiatives?
Absolutely. So we employ the adage, taken right from the disability inclusion community. We employ the adage, nothing about us without us. So our ERGs are highly involved in the development and the launch of many of our training programs. We reach right out to the aligned ERGs to review and approve the language, the content, the examples. We try to, specifically for our disability inclusion work streams, we have tried to and are in the process of extending our ERG representation, making sure that those individuals are sprinkled throughout our disability inclusion work streams. So again, I don't think I'm minimizing their impact or exaggerating. Actually, I don't believe we would be effective without our ERGs at all. And I'm not just
Fantastic.
saying that because some of them are online here. That is the truth.
Exactly. No, that's an incredible resource for most companies. Could you share some of the improvements CareSource has made in the organization in conjunction with the Self ID campaign?
Absolutely. And there's a ton of things that I want to brag about, but for the sake of time, I'll just name a few.
Okay.
As part of this process, not just the Self ID program or campaign, but leading up to it, we develop, again, our disability inclusion strategy. We established 10 work streams to work at progressing our disability inclusion strategy. We have expanded our recruiting efforts and our partnerships. We've updated our candidate accommodation request form. So again, make sure that candidates can request accommodations early. Even throughout our self-ID campaign, even before our self-ID campaign, our facilities and buildings team has done an amazing job utilizing what they call the universal design across our building and facilities. And so we're in the process of really baking disability inclusion into everything that we do so that it is baked in, not just bolted on. So I hope that gives enough flavor for the things that we've done.
Oh, absolutely. That's great input, Patrice. We again want to invite our audience to use the chat and submit any questions for us or our guest panelist. And we invite Michael Hogue back in as he has been monitoring the chat. Please drop in the chat or raise your virtual hand if you have a question. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so we've had a couple of questions come in. One really related to what you just touched on, and it's the kind of the acknowledgement of the importance of ERGs and the leadership of those ERGs. And they mentioned that it can be very challenging to balance their primary workloads with their ERG responsibilities and commitments. And especially if the members of the leadership of that ERG happen to be people with disabilities. They wanted to know if you have any tips for these ERGs and the leaders of these ERGs for interacting with the unique leadership challenges that can come with having a disability-focused ERG.
Absolutely. So I heard two questions in that, if I was following that correctly. So our ERGs, this is definitely considered work off the side of their desk. I don't like this phrase, but I can't think of anything better. It is a blessing and a curse. Our ERG leaders are passionate. They are about the business of building community for their individual communities, right? And I have had, and our equity council team have had the opportunity to say to them, hey, slow down. You can't boil an entire ocean, right? So we are in the process of helping our ERG leaders actually balance their passion for their work, but also getting their work done, because we have to get their work done first and foremost. We are offering through our Equity Council leadership development courses for our ERG leaders because we want them to be seen as future leaders, creating pools and pipelines of leaders for future roles. And then for our two ERGs that support persons with disabilities, they have amazing support from executive sponsors, from the C-suite. Their executive sponsors are C-suite ELT members. So they have amazing, amazing support. And through Equity Council, we try to support them and give them the resources that they need. If that didn't answer the question, please just reach out to me personally when we have more time. I just want to be respectful of the time that we have.
Yeah, I think you just touched on a really important point that came out in the follow-up question that came out from our audience, and it has to do with any advice you have for ERG leaders who are part of organizations or companies that aren't seeing the value of ERG supporting the business. So it sounds like it ties to that really leadership buy-in question. So any specific strategies that you've found helpful in getting that leadership support and buy-in?
Absolutely. Again, it is such a blessing. Our Chief Human Resource Officer is the executive sponsor for all things DE&I, and that's the individual to whom I report. And we sat down very early and made the decision that our ELT leaders would be executive sponsors. And so we have pushed that down, right? And there may have been, it's rumored, there may have been one or two individuals that said, I don't have time. And it's also rumored that she said, find the time. And so we do have those executive sponsors, right? But the other thing I would say is crawl, walk, run. Do the work that you know needs to be done. Prioritize progress over perfection. And keep moving, and eventually someone will say you're doing a great job and they will want to link arms with you.
Awesome. Thank you. Last is a real quick question, if you would be willing to share. I know we talked about the low percentage of self-identification that often is tied to organizations. Are you able to share what the CareSource percentage of self-identification is?
I don't know if I can share, but the people online that know me also know that I'm going to share it, and then we'll figure it out later, right? So we started, as I stated, we measure our utilization rate every quarter, and we started at 3.9, I believe it was, towards the end of the quarter Q4. And then as of yesterday, we were at 8.6. So again, steady progress, which is indicative of our commitment to building the trust and building awareness and creating sustainability.
Great. That does it for the questions that have come in. I'll turn things back over to Brian and Brynne.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Michael. Brynne, I'm going to pass it to you as we have one last question to cover one last pre-submitted question to cover. Go ahead.
Thanks, Brian. The question is, our employees sometimes get confused on the difference between voluntary self-identification of their individual with disability status versus requesting a reasonable accommodation. When we invite employees to self-identify, we do include in our communication that this is separate from reasonable accommodation, and we provide them the information on how to request an accommodation. Do you have any additional tips as to how we can make this clearer for employees? This is a great question, and this confusion is common. This is where your communication strategy will come in. Communicate your message in a format that is accessible and easy to understand with clearly defined terms. Consider sharing exactly how the information will be used, that it will be strictly for data collection and reporting purposes only. Then reassure employees that you are only using aggregate numbers, not identifying information specific to an employee with a disability. How are we doing on questions?
We have not had any others come in, so let's wrap it up.
All right. Well, thank you for all the great questions and participation. We enjoyed sharing strategies for leading an effective self-identification campaign. To summarize, we discussed what is self-identification, why it's important, and how it differs from disability disclosure. We covered the self-identification requirements for federal contractors subject to Section 503 regulations, as well as guidelines for optional campaigns. And we shared key strategies for implementing an effective self-identification campaign, emphasizing clear communication, how to use the data gained to make improvements, and the importance of following up with staff to share the results after the campaign. We also shared how OOD can be a resource for employers in your efforts to achieve your disability inclusion goals.